Hello, scholars! My name is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In the last video, we covered President Woodrow Wilson and Americans' involvement in World War I. In this video, we're going to discuss the Roaring Twenties and what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. At the end of World War I, the U.S. economy was at its highest. America was now a world power and one of the richest nations in the world. In the 1920s, American citizens enjoyed the highest standard of living in the world. Within a decade, GNP rose by 40% and American industry doubled. The industries that saw the most growth made clothing, appliances, furniture, and automobiles. In addition, Americans now had a system of credit that allowed them to purchase an item and pay for it later. It was during the 1920s that factories used electric motors instead of steam engines for power. Scientists studied the assembly line and all of its individual parts to decide if it was working at full capacity. Little changes on the assembly line equated to big increases in production, sometimes by 50 to 75%. The largest industry in the U.S. was the automobile industry. In 1920, there were at least 10 million cars on the road. By 1930, there were over 25 million automobiles on the road. Most Americans bought cars between 1922 and 1927. Advertising was imperative, and car industries came out with a new model each year, hoping Americans would trade in the old for the new. The sales of automobiles began to slow in 1927 as Henry Ford stopped making the Model T and focused on the Model A. Ford didn't know if Americans simply didn't like the Model A or if there was a lull in sales due to citizens not needing another vehicle. Even with a lull in sales, other industries had profited greatly from the purchase of automobiles. Steel, rubber, glass, and paint were all used to produce cars in this decade, and their industries all did well. As more Americans used automobiles to travel, people could now live farther from the city. Real estate developers built homes as demand increased due to automobiles. Gas stations appeared every couple of blocks between these new homes. Companies that produced electricity created buildings that served as power stations. They built massive generators that coal could be burned in and turned into electricity, which could be hooked up to businesses and homes in the city. By the end of the 1920s, more than 60% of Americans added electricity to their homes. They could now buy refrigerators, stoves, washing machines, and vacuums, which would make housework easier to complete. Families gained leisure time and enjoyed radio and movie theaters when they had the chance. The 1920s were a decade of increased entertainment where the making of motion pictures and radio broadcasting increased tremendously. Amos and Andy was popular and starred two vaudevillians. Let me insert, though, that this was a program that would be really offensive today as it featured two individuals that wore blackface. KDKA in Pittsburgh was the first radio station to gain popularity, and with its success came many more radio programs. Hollywood also thrived during this time. Enormous theaters were built that could seat as many as 3,000 to 4,000 people. The first movies with sound called Talkies came out in the middle of the late 1920s. The first sounds were music or sound effects which played along with the movie. The first film to actually have dialogue was called The Jazz Singer and came out in October of 1927. A Vitaphone was the technology used to make this possible. Even though there was great growth during the 1920s, there were still some major weaknesses within the economy. Railroads had tremendous problems with management and its vast numbers of employees. The industry was known for spending way too much money and overextending itself. When trucks were produced, the railroad now had a competitor and didn't do well with it. The coal mines and its workers also struggled as natural gas and petroleum were introduced. Coal was often extremely dirty, especially when it was burned, and natural gas, petroleum, replaced it as a more efficient means to create power. Agriculture was probably the industry that had the most trouble nearing the end of the 1920s. Farmers did not have any problem and thrived during the years of World War I. Feeding Europe and the U.S. created great profits for American farmers. When the war ended and Europe got back on its feet, farm exports dropped substantially. By the end of the 1920s, urban workers making low wages were doing better than American farmers. The industries that did thrive in the 1920s used paid vacations, pensions, and improvements in working conditions to keep their workers from striking. Some businesses used yellow dog contracts, which kept employees from joining unions. Almost all employees in factories earned wages that brought them a bit of spending money with each paycheck. The only workers that still struggled quite a bit were Black Americans. Remember from the last video that labor agents had traveled to the South during World War I and helped many Black Americans to move to the North for jobs. Almost 500,000 Black Americans had found jobs washing dishes, collecting garbage, and completing domestic work. But these jobs were never as good as the jobs given to white individuals. Blacks continued to move north during the 1920s, and the populations of northern cities grew rapidly. Chicago's population doubled within 10 years. Many African Americans that moved to New York settled in Harlem, and its population rose from about 150,000 to 325,000. The individuals that thrived the most during the 1920s were the middle and upper class whites. This was not because they were smarter or deserved to be making more money. This was because certain populations of people had access to education due to inheritance or material gain. Those in managerial positions were very much financially rewarded during this time. The profits of a majority of corporations doubled in the 1920s. Americans that made enough money to be able to spend a little on leisure activities also had the choice of saving their money. Those that saved their money sometimes had enough to buy a second car or invested it in the stock market. The 1920s was a decade that first started to determine who would be wealthy and who would be poor within the U.S. The unequal distribution of wealth within the nation became evident. By the 1920s, more than half of all Americans lived in cities. When land became scarce, Americans decided to build into the air higher and higher so more people could live and work in smaller areas of space. The Empire State Building was completed in 1931 and was the tallest building in the world for many years. By the end of the 1920s, more than 350 buildings had at least 20 stories piled on top of one another. As cities grew into the skies, Americans lost touch with small communities that centered on church, home, work, and schools. These changes definitely impacted American families. Wives and children were the individuals that saw the greatest amount of change economically and socially. The women that did work during the 1920s were often teachers, nurses, stenographers, or did domestic work. Many believed that the 19th Amendment gaining the right to vote would bring about significant social change for women, but it did not. Some women fought for society's norms by wearing makeup, dancing in public, and raising their skirts above the knee. Other women cut their hair really short, smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, and bound their chests. Flappers were a distinctive group of women that pushed economic, social, and sexual boundaries. Many historians consider flappers the first independent women within America. Flappers were found in speakeasies or clubs where they drank alcohol, danced, and smoked cigarettes. These women were especially known for what they wore. A typical flapper dress was short, had a long neckline, and was form-fitting. High-heeled shoes often accompanied their dress, and underneath they wore lingerie. Colorful makeup and a bob hairstyle was usually common. Many women that still carried Victorian beliefs thought flappers were immoral, had poor values, and shouldn't exist within society. Historians also note the increase of crime during the 1920s. Many believe it was because of Prohibition. Those that made, bought, or sold alcohol were now breaking the law. Middle and upper-class Americans frequented speakeasies, which were bars that were hidden from the public and were also called blind pigs or blind tigers. Academics believe that speakeasies might have been named this because people had to whisper through a hole in the door the name of the person that had allowed them to enter, or a code word. No one really knows for sure where the name came from. Those that created the speakeasies often had little snacks they would provide to drunk people to help sober them up. Later, Americans hosted cocktail parties in their homes where appetizers or small pieces of finger food were offered. The mob began to thrive in the 1920s in cities like Chicago and New York, as many mob bosses ran speakeasies, which had gambling and prostitution rings. There was lots of money to be made in these establishments. Al Capone, a streetwise youth of two Italian immigrant parents, was put in charge of an organization that brought in millions of dollars. Capone was brutal and cunning and wiped out competitors by putting hits on them and earned himself a seat on the FBI's most wanted list by the end of the 1920s. He is well known for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where lots of men were gunned down and died. Capone, definitely hated but secretly respected by Eliot Ness, who prided himself on being a federal agent whose men could not be turned. Ness and his men were known as the Untouchables. Eventually Capone was captured and put into prison because he evaded his taxes. On a lighter side, boxing, golf, and baseball continued to be very popular during the 1920s. 5,000 golf courses sprung up in the nation, and world-famous boxers like Tunney and Dempsey entertained the crowds. Babe Ruth became a baseball legend in the 1920s where he hit 60 home runs. College sports drew crowds, and universities built massive stadiums for fans to watch the big games. Momentous achievements also took place. Gertrude Ederle became the first woman to swim the length of the English Channel. Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic Ocean all by himself in his plane. He was seen as a national hero, and the term rugged individualism found its way into America's history. Ernest Hemingway became an extremely popular author during the 1920s. He wrote novels about individuals who were brave and found personal honor through their own courage. F. Scott Fitzgerald was another famous writer during this time. He wrote The Side of Paradise in 1920 and The Great Gatsby in 1925. The Great Gatsby was riveting and showed the emptiness of human behavior. His characterization made his novels extremely memorable. Jazz music continued to thrive, and the blues became extremely sought after. Black Americans used the blues to express the extent of their suffering in emotional lyrics that were accompanied by the piano as well as brass instruments. No one could resist the songs that became a national folk music for Black Americans. Art, music, sculpture, dance, writing, and poetry were celebrated in New York, specifically in Harlem in this time period, and became known as the Harlem Renaissance. The YMCA on 135th Street became the place to be for concerts and plays. There were also rent parties where jazz musicians played to raise literally rent money to help writers and artists pay the bills. Many celebrities came to Harlem to experience the incredible music and art. The NAACP moved its main building there in 1923. Blacks were still kept from many opportunities in the 1920s, but made great intellectual and cultural strides. The number of Black individuals that graduated college in this decade increased by almost 1,500. One of the more difficult aspects of the 1920s was the Red Scare. It started in 1919 when the Russian Revolution was taking place. Marxism and the Bolsheviks scared Americans because they believed in communism, and people worried that communists would take over the world. In 1919, the U.S. had about 60,000 Americans that claimed themselves as communists. Americans have the right, according to the U.S. Constitution, to be part of any political party or to have certain beliefs, as long as those beliefs don't infringe upon another citizen's life, liberty, or property. A feeling of unrest was present in 1919 when various strikes took place in the nation, like in Seattle and Boston, and bombings also took place. In addition, a New York postal worker somehow detected 16 to 17 homemade bombs that were about to be sent to various famous people. The straw that broke the camel's back was when a bomb exploded outside of the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The Attorney General wasn't hurt, but he'd had enough. They traced the bomb back to an Italian immigrant, and Palmer decided to lead an attack on radical immigrants. Months of immigrant raids took place in which anyone suspected of being a communist or an anarchist was immediately deported out of the country. Many of the immigrants that were seized and deported were innocent of the charges placed upon them. Attorney General Palmer definitely extended himself too far when he had officials round up 4,000 immigrants in 24 hours. The Department of Labor stepped forward and demanded due process and hearing for all immigrants before they could be deported. On May 1st, Palmer basically ended his career when he ordered the New York police force of 11,000 officers to prepare themselves for a revolution by immigrants and took to the streets, but nothing happened. Palmer lost all his credibility after this episode, and his Red Scare techniques and tactics dwindled away. The consequences of the Red Scare were horrendous for those that became intertwined with it. Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants that lived in Massachusetts during the 1920s. Sacco made shoes and Vanzetti sold fish. A robbery and murder had taken place, and Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested because they were known to have radical anarchist beliefs, and they fit the description of the men that committed the crime. Historians have no idea whether or not they actually committed the crime, but the two immigrants were convicted not because of evidence, but because of their values and beliefs. They both were electrocuted via chair on August 23, 1927. Their deaths represent the prejudice, racism, and discrimination that took place against certain immigrants during this decade. Another example of the hatred and discrimination that gained power during the 1920s was the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK, as it was known, started to gain power and membership during World War I, but it grew substantially during the 20s, right along with the Red Scare. The only individuals that were allowed to become members of the KKK were white, native-born Americans that were Protestant. Many white men that didn't necessarily identify with anything and were lonely found kinship in the Klan, enamored with the titles they could earn by being members: Imperial Wizard, Grand Dragon. Poor and uneducated white individuals flocked to the Klan. They had unusual rituals that were supposed to represent their hate for Catholics, Jews, non-native immigrants, and Black Americans. Klan members didn't like immigrants that spoke different languages. They utilized violent means to get individuals to behave the way that they wanted them to. They flogged, burned, threw acid on, beat to near death, and murdered anyone that they felt needed it. The KKK was successful at entering politics as well. Members of the KKK gained seats in the state legislatures in Oklahoma, Texas, Indiana, and Oregon. The hate group had 5 million members by the middle of the decade. Even though they didn't like others speaking anything but English, the Klan thought that they could change the English language to fit their needs. The KKK had a calendar and met weekly at a local clavern. The hate group hosted picnics, parades, and scared others by burning crosses at night in full costume. The KKK also had an organization for women, for boys, and for girls. When the Klan started setting fires to public buildings, kidnapping, and lynching people, the public quickly turned against them. There were also sexual scandals by certain KKK leaders, and funds were not used the way they were supposed to be. By the end of the 1920s, much of the Klan had disappeared, thankfully. The anti-immigrant sentiment of the decade definitely infiltrated the federal level. In 1917, Congress created a literacy test that immigrants would have to take in order to be allowed into the country. This greatly reduced the number of immigrants that were able to come to America. Congress passed the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, which allowed only 3% of each nationality to be allowed to enter the U.S. Congress then passed the National Origins Quota Act in 1924, which set the number of European immigrants to 150,000 a year, and a majority of those immigrants came from England, Scandinavia, Ireland, and Germany. This quota system stayed in place for about 40 years. A clash of cultures also meant that citizens would argue about what should be taught to their children in schools. Various religious beliefs didn't always coincide with scientific principles. Tennessee state law made it illegal for educators to teach evolution, and if they did, they would be fined. Thomas Scopes, who was a young high school science teacher, taught evolution, which historians later found out that he'd done on purpose. The case immediately became popular, and William Jennings Bryan, who had run for president many times, decided to lead the prosecution. The outstanding attorney Clarence Darrow headed the defense of Scopes with the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, behind him. The trial was nicknamed the Monkey Trial. The trial immediately grew tense when the defense refused to pray with the judge at the beginning of the day. Religious revival tents had been put up outside the courtroom, and the town looked like a carnival had come to town. Vendors even set up booths where they sold stuffed monkeys, hot dogs, lemonade, and Bibles. The courtroom became so full that the judge had to move the case outside because he was worried that the floor of the building was going to collapse. In the end, Scopes lost the trial and had to pay a $100 fine. Clarence Darrow basically humiliated Bryan to the point that he'd actually died a few days later after the trial was over. In the election of 1920, Warren G. Harding won the president. He wasn't expected to win, and no one really saw it coming, but he did. Warren Harding was considered handsome and knew how to present himself well as a professional. He'd served as a legislator as well as a lieutenant governor and was quite happy when he was elected a U.S. senator. When he was elected president, he wasn't quite sure of how to do the job, but he picked experienced individuals for his cabinet. His administration soon became problematic, though. The Attorney General and the Secretary of Interior became involved in what was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Harding had just suffered a heart attack when the scandal became known. His Secretary of Interior ended up spending a year in jail, and Harding's reputation never revived itself. Harding then ended up having another heart attack and died, bringing Vice President Calvin Coolidge to the presidency. Luckily, Coolidge had lots of integrity and honesty, which helped to calm the nation. He was good at creating peace where others didn't think it was possible, and because of this, he gained a full term as president in 1924. In the election of 1928, Herbert Hoover ran against Al Smith. Herbert Hoover was extremely hardworking, intelligent, and sold the idea of being a self-made man. Hoover had been an orphan and had worked hard to get into Stanford University. He'd eventually become an engineer, but ended up in politics. Hoover did not really drink, and people respected him for that. He won the election easily, as if there was no purpose to the election in the first place. Had Hoover known, though, that everything that was about to come up in his presidency, he may have reconsidered running for president. All right, well, this is the end of the video. We're going to say goodbye to the 1920s and usher in a decade of difficulty, the Great Depression. Hope all my viewers out there are okay. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and click that like button. Have an amazing day, and I will talk with you soon.